Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I am Trillian Atwood, the Director of Public Programs and Visitor Services at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual presentation today, Return to Jewish Cuba with Ruth Behar. Now, tonight we're pleased to continue our series of programs celebrating global Jewish life. For those of you who missed the opening presentation, Recalling Jewish Calcutta with Yael Silliman, you can now view the recording at the link in chat. Up next in the series is a movie on the banks of the Tigris, a powerful documentary about traditional Jewish Iraqi music. This event is a little different for the JMM, and the movie will be available over a 48-hour viewing window, so you have some flexibility on when you decide to enjoy that film. Spaces are limited for that program, so we encourage you to register today using the link that will pop up in chat. So tonight we'll be hearing about the Jewish community in Cuba from our speaker, Ruth Behar. As a cultural anthropologist, poet and writer, teacher and public speaker, Ruth Behar is known for the compassion she brings to her quest to understand the depth of the human experience. She was born in Havana and grew up in New York and has lived in Spain and Mexico. She returns often to Cuba to build bridges around culture, literature, art, and Jewish life, and is the editor of the classic anthology Bridges to Cuba. Behar's books about her travels, translated Woman, The Vulnerable Observer, An Island Called Home, and Traveling Heavy, are acclaimed for their unique mix of personal and scholarly writing. She is the author of a bilingual book of poetry, Everything I Kept. Behar made her fiction debut with her novel for young people, Lucky Broken Girl, which won the Pura Belpré Medal. She was the first Latino to win a MacArthur Genius Grant. She's also received a Guggenheim Fellowship and was named a Great Immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. Behar is the Victor Haim Pereira Collegiate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And so with that, please welcome me in joining Ms. Behar to the virtual JMM. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Trillian Atwood, for that beautiful introduction and your beautiful accent as well, which I adore. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank Laura Grant, who was involved in organizing my event. So thank you so much. It's really, really a pleasure to be here with all of you today and looking forward to talking about Jewish Cuba. I'm about to share my screen. I'll be showing you some images to keep the talk going. So I'll get started right away. So in talking about the Jews of Cuba, people always want to know, well, why did Jews go to Cuba, right? That's usually one of the first questions that I get. And there's a very, very clear answer for that, and that is that the door was closed to the United States in the 20s and 30s when most of the Jews were trying to leave Europe between World War I and World War II. And so they searched for refuge elsewhere, and many went to Cuba. So let me give you a little more background on this. So you probably know that many Jews immigrated to the United States in the late 19th century. There was a large, large immigration from Eastern Europe, in particular, to the U.S. And there were many in the U.S. Who were very against this immigration, and you can see in this anti-Semitic cartoon, The Persecuted, in quotes, that there were many who did not want to see this presence, this Jewish presence, continue in the United States. And so by 1924, the US government an Immigration Act that seeks to limit, as it says here, the immigration of aliens into the United States and for other purposes. And so it was very, very difficult for Jews to be able to enter the US. There were quotas enacted. And here you get a sense of some of the numbers. The numbers were good if you were from Western Europe, but if you were from Poland or elsewhere in Eastern Europe, and also if you were Italian or Spanish or Portuguese and Turkish, those numbers were very, very limited. The quotas were very, very limited for people coming from those countries, and particularly those coming from Eastern Europe and Turkey were largely Jewish, and so they were affected by this Immigration Act. So that gives you a sense numerically of why so many people went to places like Cuba because they couldn't come into the United States. Now, something you may not know is that really the first people to live publicly as Jewish people in Cuba were American Jews. And many American Jews settled in Cuba after the Spanish-American War, which was in 1898, and after Cuba ceases to be a Spanish colony and essentially becomes an American colony. That's when people say that baseball entered Cuba, and that's when religious freedom also entered Cuba. And that is when Jews were able to publicly and openly practice their Judaism in Cuba. And so the first were American Jews. They founded the first cemetery, the first Jewish cemetery, which is on the outskirts of Havana in the town of Guanabacoa, founded in 1906. And we have family buried in this cemetery. And American Jews also had businesses in Cuba, among them this very famous restaurant, the Moishe Pipik restaurant, an American Jewish kosher restaurant. Later, they had their own synagogue, an American Reform synagogue in Havana with an American rabbi as well. So this American presence was American Jewish presence was part of the Jewish scene in Cuba. But it was a small community, and the larger community was made up by the Sephardi and Ashkenazi immigrants that started arriving in the teens and 20s into the 30s and 40s. So let me tell you a little bit about that migration. So they came largely from Poland and Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe, like Hungary and many other places, and from Turkey, some from Syria to Cuba in this period, largely in the 20s and 30s. And my own family was part of this migration. Here are my paternal grandparents, my abuelo and my abuela, who came from Turkey. They met in Cuba and married, and they were both from the same town of Silivri, not too far from Istanbul, a seaside town. And they and many other Sephardic Jewish immigrants from this area migrated to Cuba in the 20s. And they were part of this Sephardic community, many of whom settled in the old part of Havana, La Habana Vieja, and others went off to other parts of the island, particularly to Santiago de Cuba and Guantanamo on the eastern end of the island. But this was their temple in Havana, founded in 1914, the Shevet Ahim synagogue. And curiously, it was on Calle del Inquisidor, was where it was located, the Street of the Inquisitor, which is ironic for Sephardic Jews, who of course were persecuted by the Inquisition. And then my maternal grandparents, my Baba and Zede, they were from Eastern Europe, my grandmother from Poland and my grandfather from Russia. And I'll be talking more about my grandmother later in the presentation, my grandmother Esther. And they came very, very poor, penniless immigrants. My grandfather, who you just saw, his name was Moishe Glinietsky when he arrived in Cuba, and his name became Maximo Glinsky after a while. And he was very proud that he worked on the railroad in Cuba, that he had helped to build the railroad in Cuba. And but most of the men were street peddlers. They worked as street peddlers in Cuba. They moved all around the city of Havana and to small towns and villages all over the island, selling whatever they could carry on their backs and shoulders, fabrics and clothes and all kinds of things that they could carry. This was my grandfather's brother, my great uncle, Simon. And most of the Jews eventually prospered in Cuba, and they largely became owners of small stores, of mom and pop shops. Here are my grandparents, again, my maternal grandparents. And after many years of work and struggle, they were finally able to open up a lace store in Havana, in La Habana Vieja, and here they are photographed with their employee. So the Jews by the 40s and 50s really began to prosper in Cuba and began to feel that this was going to be their home. There were definitely Jews that used Cuba as a kind of trampoline to eventually jump over to the United States, to acquire visas to come into the United States. But there were many, many, 15,000 by the 1950s, who chose to stay in Cuba and make Cuba their home. And it's really interesting to find Jewish writers from this era who wrote about Jose Marti, who was the great independence leader and poet. And this was a poem originally in Yiddish, translated into Spanish. Tierra de bendición, cantan las cañas y en el tabaco al paraíso asciende. And blessed land, singing amid sugarcane and tobacco to its rising paradise. So for these Jews that stayed in Cuba, Cuba had become a kind of paradise. This was their home, and they were planning to stay in Cuba forever. And in this map, you get a sense of how the Jewish community blossomed in Cuba and spread all over the island. I was fortunately able to travel to Cuba several times and visit all of these places, and it was always really amazing to me to see that there were synagogues, not only 5 synagogues in Havana, but synagogues all over the island of Cuba, and Jewish cemeteries in very far removed places like Banes and Camajuani. It was really incredible to see the Jewish cemeteries in those places. So the Jews really established themselves in Cuba. By 1959, there were about 15,000 Jewish people on the island. And one of the ways that you get a sense that this community really thought they were going to stay and wanted to really set down roots in Cuba is that in the 50s, mid 50s, they build their Jewish community center, what we call the Patronato, La Casa de la Comunidad Hebrea de Cuba. They start building it in 1953, and they hire Cuba's most important architect at the time, Capablanca, to design this synagogue, this Jewish community center. This is what it looks like today, and it continues to be a very, very important center for the Jewish community and for all visitors who come to Cuba searching for the Jews. This is the pilgrimage site that people always go to. And curiously, we lived half a block away from the Patronato synagogue, so this synagogue was also very much a part of my early childhood. And every time I go back to Cuba, I'm always spending a lot of time there. It's like my home back in Cuba, my Jewish home in Cuba. So my parents marry in 1956 at this moment when the community is very prosperous and very well settled in Cuba. To my father's side are his parents, his Sephardic parents, and to my mother's side, her Ashkenazi parents and grandparents. And when they married, it was very unusual for an Ashkenazi and a Sephardic Jew to marry. The communities knew each other, but they were very separate. They were very culturally separate. They had separate enclaves, and it was really a very unusual thing for this marriage to take place. And I was always very aware that I grew up with 2 very different Jewish cultures as part of my identity. So they married. I was born soon after, 9 months later, and we often spent a lot of time walking on the iconic Malecón of Havana. Here I am with my mother, so we're always very close to the ocean in Havana. And the community at that time, as I said, really felt they were part of Cuba. They really identified with the symbols of Cuba, among them the Tropicana nightclub, which was Cuba's most famous and beautiful nightclub. And here you see this ad in Yiddish to go to the nightclub. And that was very much a part of Cuba of the 50s. And to such an extent that there was a special flight from Miami that you could take, where Tropicana dancers would be there and perform for you to get you ready for the fun at the actual Tropicana club in Havana. And Cuba and the U.S. were very interconnected in this moment, to such an extent that there was a ferry you could take from South Florida and put your car on the ferry and take it down to Havana, and then drive around with your own car, literally, in Cuba. So that was the degree and the extent of the connection between the U.S. and Cuba. But another journey, a second diaspora was waiting for my family and many other Cubans. An unexpected change happened with the revolution in Cuba, which begins in 1959 when Fidel Castro takes power and enters Havana, and brings about obviously many huge changes in Cuba. And initially, the Jews of Cuba are supportive of the revolution, and they don't all leave right away in 1959, but stay a little bit and test the waters. And it's very interesting that Rabbi Gambach, who was a personal friend of the family, he publishes a Haggadah for Passover in 1960. So he's still there in Cuba in that year after the revolution. But everything changes in 1961 with the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And that's when Fidel Castro declares that the revolution is going to be communist in April of 1961. And then many businesses and properties are nationalized or confiscated by the Cuban government for the revolution. And that's the moment at which many Cubans, particularly middle class and upper class Cubans, decide to leave. And the Jewish people largely leave at this moment. 90% of that community of 15,000 decides to leave, many of them because they lose their stores and businesses with the revolution. This is what happened, for example, with my grandparents who lost their lace shop and then they left Cuba. And here's you see my grandmother leaving Cuba in this picture. So then a second diaspora from Havana, in our case, up to New York. Most of the Jewish Cubans went to Miami, but many also went to New York, as did my family. Here I am with my parents and my brother, starting a new life in New York. And of course, getting used to a very different climate, a very different reality, the snow in New York. And so I was very aware of my identity as a Cuban New Yorker, but then my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, who I've mentioned before, Esther and my grandfather Maximo, retired and settled in Miami Beach. And I got to know the Jewish Cuban community in Miami Beach starting in the 70s. They were very happily retired in Miami Beach, my grandmother often cooking, my grandfather helping to wash the dishes in their kitchen there. And I wanted to share this recipe here, which you might be able to see is a recipe for gefilte fish. You see the fish there, white fish, yellow carp, yellow fish and carp, I believe. And then on the left, you see that it's all written out in Spanish. So this wonderful cultural fusion, the gefilte fish recipe in Spanish, because that was how my grandmother was thinking, having become essentially Cuban from all her years living on the island, but matzah meal is in English. So I learned that the Cuban Jewish community wasn't very well received initially by the American Jewish community in Miami, and they missed their tradition so much of Cuba that they built two synagogues. The Ashkenazi Cuban Jews built the Cuban Hebrew synagogue. And as you can see in this image, remembering the patronato that I mentioned before, the Jewish community center. So again, remembering Cuba, building in Miami, but remembering the temple in Cuba. And then the Sephardic Cuban Jews built Temple Moses, also in Miami Beach. And there too, they're remembering the loss of their life in Cuba, founded in 1968 by Cuban Jewish refugees forced into exile during the early 1960s. We will never forget what we left behind on the island of Cuba. So poignant that this was a community that planned to stay in Cuba forever and did not expect to be leaving and had to leave everything behind, their houses, their possessions, their temples, their Torahs, everything that they had built in Cuba, and start again in Miami, literally a double diaspora, and starting again. So hearing all of this, I was so curious to learn more about the Jewish community in Cuba, to learn who had stayed, what life was like for the few Jews that remained on the island. And so I started traveling back to Cuba 30 years ago as an anthropologist and studying the Jewish community of the island. And that led to my book, An Island Called Home, Returning to Jewish Cuba. And initially in those first trips to Cuba, I would just look for the places where I had stood as a child and try to reclaim these places, try to reclaim these memories. As you can see here, kind of literally standing in the same place now as an adult woman. And as I mentioned, we lived so close to the patronato, so close to this temple. So there was also this kind of magnetic force pulling me back to the Patronato, and I briefly attended Jewish day school in Havana as well. And here you see me with my school uniform. So just remembering all of these things that had tied me to Cuba as a small child. And initially, just trying to understand the fragments of what was left, the pieces of what was left of Jewish life in Cuba, going to that cemetery that I mentioned that was built by American Jews in 1906, finding things broken and trying to understand, what was still left of these pieces, and how was I going to put this all together and understand what was happening with the Jewish community in Cuba today, which is a very small community of about 1,000 people today. And one of my guides, a very important guide, is Adela Dworin, who is the president of the Jewish community of Cuba. And her office is right in the Patronato synagogue, in the library of the synagogue, which I've always thought was very meaningful. This is where she wants to spend her time amidst the Jewish books that they have taken care of during all the years of the revolution. And she's an incredible person who knows the community from before the revolution and after the revolution, and totally fluent in Spanish, Yiddish, and English, and gives incredible presentations about the history of the Jews of Cuba. And many other incredible people that I met. Albertico Behar, same name as my father, and he is an incredible person. He had all of these possessions, Jewish possessions, that had belonged to his grandfather, to his Sephardic Turkish grandfather, the talit and the kippah, and many other things, books and memorabilia that he showed to me. And that were so important to him. And he leads services at the Patronato Synagogue and incorporates Sephardic songs into the services, always very beautiful. Ida Goodstad, who was born in Cuba, but her mother and sister came to Cuba on a Polish passport. And her father was a Holocaust survivor, a survivor of Auschwitz, who brought his uniform with him to Cuba. And that's what she's holding there in her hands. And it was fascinating to see the various kinds of documents that people had held on to as evidence of their Jewishness. Sarah here and her husband are holding up her parents' ketubah, their marriage contract. And interestingly, with this document, her son and daughter and niece and nephew were able to leave Cuba for Israel. And this was proof, showing this as proof of their Jewish identity and their Jewish heritage. She has many other documents and photographs, and this was very poignant, showing me the photographs of the last quinceañera, the last 15th birthday party that was held for all of these Jewish young girls at the Patronato Synagogue in 1959. This was the last 1959, the last party for the quinceañeras that was held at the synagogue. And then that picture is a picture of her. And she said to me, of all those young women who were here then, I'm the only one that is still in Cuba. And I had the honor of meeting Jaime Gans Green, who has since passed away. An incredible story. He lived in Palma Soriano. He was the last Jewish person living in this small town on the eastern end of Cuba, very near Santiago de Cuba. And he had photographs, and he had letters, and all kinds of things that he had kept from relatives, many of whom had perished in the Holocaust. So now the community continues to evolve, and I just wanted to give you kind of a sense of the community today with these last images. It's a community, Jewish community now, that's much more connected to the global Jewish community. And they're on the internet now and on Facebook, and much more involved with what's going on with the Jewish world, which is really amazing. And it's also a very diverse community. Many of the women have married into the community. They've married men of Jewish ancestry, and then they have converted. So there are many people who are converts or Jews by choice in the community, and that fills out the numbers of Jewish people in the community in Cuba. And they receive or have been receiving aid from American Jews, Canadian Jews, Latin American Jews, and particularly donations of things like gefilte fish and matzah and things like that for Passover, which they very much appreciate and treasure. And there is one synagogue in Havana that's an Orthodox synagogue, Adath Israel. And since many American Jews over the years, over the last 20, 30 years, have been visiting and wanting to help the Jewish community on the island, they started making kippahs and other things, hand sewing things that they sell to help support their synagogue. And that's what you're seeing here. And it's really amazing. There is a group of young people in the community as well, young people and children in the community. They have a Sunday school where kids learn about Jewish history and Hebrew and so on. And they have a dance group, the Rikudim group, that performs at holidays. And typically pre-pandemic, they have these really big festivals for Hanukkah, and they invite people, leaders of other religious faiths, to create interfaith cooperation as well. And this was a Hanukkah party just a couple of years ago with the dancers, the young dancers performing. So very much, they've developed very much a sense of themselves as a community and reaching out to other faiths and other religious communities in Cuba, which is pretty amazing. So all of that was background and inspiration for the book I recently wrote called Letters from Cuba, which is a novel. And it brings together family history, cultural anthropology, and my imagination. And here's the cover of the book. And you can see at the very top left-hand corner, you can see that that's supposed to be representing Poland, which is the country that my maternal grandmother left. Then you see Havana, you see the ocean and Havana there in the center, the lighthouse. And then down at the bottom, you see some palm trees and some land. And that represents the town of Agramonte that I'm going to talk about now, a town in the countryside of Cuba. So most people, when they think about the Jews of Cuba, think about the St. Louis ship. This was a ship that was turned away, and it was filled with 934 German Jewish refugees who were trying to leave in 1939 and seeking refuge in Cuba. And unfortunately, this ship was turned away. Only a handful were allowed in, and they were turned away. And then they went on to the US and to Canada, where they were also turned away. But Cuba is usually blamed most of all for the St. Louis, and a very, very sad story. About a third of the people that were sent back perished in concentration camps. And it's a very sad story. And people often think that because of that, Cuba wasn't a sanctuary for Jews, but in fact, it was a very, very important sanctuary. And most of the Jews who went to Cuba were able to enter and to create a new home on the island. And this was the case for my family. And in particular, in Letters from Cuba, I decided to focus on the story of my maternal grandmother, Esther, who was from the town of Govorovo, which you see here. Excuse me for one moment. And so she left Govorovo. Here's my grandmother, Esther. She left Govorovo and went to Cuba. She was the eldest in real life, of 7 children. And her father had already gone to Cuba 3 years before. And he finally was able to amass enough money to bring one of the children to Cuba. And he wanted to bring one of his sons. But my grandmother was the eldest of the children. And she begged him and said, even though I'm a girl, I'm going to help you bring everybody to Cuba. And so he finally agreed. She went to Cuba first by herself as a young woman, went to Cuba and helped my great-grandfather bring the rest of the family to Cuba right on the eve of the Holocaust, and essentially saved her family. So that was the inspiration for my book, Letters from Cuba. I made the Esther in the book a little bit younger, changed a couple of things to make it fiction, but it was inspired by this story. And here you see my maternal grandmother in the white dress sitting in the front next to her mother, my great-grandmother. My great-grandfather is the man with the Panama hat, and the family there reunited in a small town called Agramonte in the province of Matanzas. And I always thought it was so interesting. They were the only Jewish family there that they went to live in Agramonte and had a general store that they all took care of and ran. And I always thought that was so fascinating that they had gone to Agramonte. Now, my grandmother wasn't able to save her whole family. There were others who stayed behind in Poland. And the saddest story is the one she always told of her grandmother. This would be my great great grandmother, who didn't want to leave Poland. That was her home. And the idea of going to Cuba, which she didn't know much about and which people thought was a kind of jungle out in the tropics, didn't sound very appealing. And she stayed behind and died in the Holocaust. And I always heard that story and saw this picture on my grandparents' wall in Miami Beach, and it made a deep, deep impact on me. And so that also, you have to read the book, that also enters into the story, into the novel. Here are my grandparents and my Aunt Sylvia, and the little girl is my mother, and they lived in Agramonte. The family eventually dispersed, went to live in Havana, Matanzas, and they were the last ones to stay behind in Agramonte. So I was very, very curious to learn more about Agramonte. They eventually moved to Havana and opened up that lace store that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And so my curiosity was fired, and I just had to find out more about Agramonte. Here are some historic pictures of what the town looked like in the 20s and 30s. And I decided to go and do some research in Agramonte and to set my novel in Agramonte. So I had to go and see what it was like and learn more about the history and the traditions and the culture of this town. This is what it looks like today. And so I found out that there are many different cultural intersections in Agramonte, as in the rest of Cuba: Spanish Cuban, Afro Cuban, Chinese Cuban, and Jewish Cuban. And so here, Columbus, right, discovering Cuba, bringing Catholicism to the island. Many people from West Africa, from the area now known as Nigeria, were forced into slavery and brought to Cuba to work in the sugarcane fields. And there were many, many sugarcane fields in this area of Matanzas. And so these people brought their traditions and their religion as well to Cuba. You can still see fragments left of the plantations, walls, and what's left of the barracks where enslaved Africans lived. You can see all that still in the landscape around Agramonte. And I was very moved to find out about this sacred tree, the Seba Tree, which, as you can see, has a chain around it to represent slavery, and people leave offerings there at the foot of the tree. And I was very, very moved by that, remembering the spirits of the enslaved Africans. I also went to a house in Agramonte where this woman has a fountain, a spring coming out from the ground, and it's inside her house, and she believes that that is from the deity Yemaya. Yemaya is the goddess of the ocean, who is syncretized with the Virgin of Regla, who is seen, whose shrine is right at the entrance to the port of Havana. So Catholic saints and African orishas, as they are called, blended together and to create a new religion. It's often called Santeria. And so I became very, very interested in learning more about that and bringing that culture and that setting into the novel. In Agramonte, there's a lot of belief in San Lazaro, Saint Lazarus, who's a deity who helps people with various kinds of injuries and illnesses. And they have a 3-day bembe, a 3-day saint party, basically, with drumming, as you can see here, with bata drumming. The batas are drummed on their sides and chanting and dancing, and it's very, very beautiful and very moving, and it derives from the Yoruba traditions from West Africa. So I wanted to bring that into the novel and show Esther learning about this culture as she lives in Agramonte with her father. And then I learned that there were also Chinese Cubans living in Agramonte, and there were many Chinese Cubans in Havana. There was this very important Chinese neighborhood in Havana. It still exists. It's not what it was, obviously, back in the 50s, but still still remnants of it exist. And in fact, Chinese Cubans left Cuba more or less at the same time as Jewish Cubans did. And we always, when I was growing up in Queens, New York, we would always go to eat Chinese Cuban food. I think it connected us back to Cuba in a very important way. So this Chinese presence in Cuba is very, very important. Lots of Chinese men came to Cuba at the end of the 19th century, also to work in the sugar fields as indentured laborers, and that's where that Chinese presence comes from. And I was really amazed to find this monument as well in Havana, remembering the memory of the Chinese that fought for the independence of Cuba at the end of the 19th century. So again, so Cuba recognizes this important presence and this important part of its history. So I wanted to bring all of those cultures together in the novel. If you read the novel, you'll see that they all connect with one another, and Esther meets people who represent all of these different cultures, and her Jewish culture becomes part of this really fascinating intersection of cultures in the story. So I had to find a way for Esther to be able to save her family. So I thought that I would focus on sewing dresses, because she gets to Cuba and she's wearing a wool dress and woolen stockings, and it's a tropical climate. And after trying to survive with a woolen dress, she realizes that she needs to sew a dress for herself that's appropriate for that climate. She sews a dress, and then she starts thinking, well, I know how to sew. Maybe I can make dresses to sell in Cuba. So I came up with that idea because my grandmother's family, they were all into sewing and fabric, and it just seemed right. And I knew about the store El Encanto, the Enchantment, which was a very famous store in Havana, very elegant store, and people were very proud of Havana at that time as being like the Paris of the Caribbean, and the El Encanto kind of symbolized that enchantment with Havana. And so I thought, well, we'll find a way for Esther to make dresses and sell them at El Encanto. You'll have to read the book to find out how she pulls that off, and that's how she's able to help save her family. And it's a store that was burnt down in 1961. So it also represents the past in so many ways. So all of that came together in my novel, Letters from Cuba. I wanted to honor the memory of Baba, of my maternal grandmother, create this fictional Esther inspired by her courage, and I wrote it all as letters. And so she's writing letters to her younger sister Malka. I thought that would be a very intimate way and personal way for her to tell the story. She's telling her younger sister everything that she's learning on this journey to Cuba. She's discovering the ocean. She'd never left her community, her shtetl in Poland, in Goworowo. Sometimes she has many fears, right? And she says, I'm crossing the ocean, but it feels as if the ocean is crossing me. So the whole book is the series of letters that she's writing to her younger sister, Malka. And I knew that she would have written the letters in Yiddish, because my grandmother was a Yiddish speaker. That was her first language, and she spoke and wrote in Yiddish in addition to Polish and Spanish and English. And so I had a translator translate that page you just saw into Yiddish, so I could imagine what it would have looked like in Yiddish had I been able to write it in Yiddish, here handwritten in Yiddish and here printed in Yiddish. I had to just be able to imagine that. And now also, fortunately, the book has been translated into Spanish, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with readers in Cuba as well, and particularly friends in Agramonte who are very, very curious to read the book. So I hope that that will happen soon. And so I want to come back to my grandmother here with this postcard that she wrote in Yiddish. So I didn't have letters that she wrote, but I had these postcards that gave me a sense of her culture. And here you can see the translation of the postcard. And if there's one lesson that I want to share from this book, it's this point here made in this letter. So many people are looking for a place to call home. I want to imagine that the world has a very large heart and can give all of us who have lost our homes a chance to start over. And I remain very grateful to Cuba for the refuge and sanctuary that Cuba gave to my grandmother and to my other three grandparents, without which they probably would not have survived the war and the Holocaust. And so Cuba really became a sanctuary. And I always remember my grandparents and the courage and hope and faith that it took to go to a new country like Cuba and start all over again. There I am as a child with my grandmother and grandfather, and I'm just so honored to be able to tell their story, and hopefully by telling their story, everything that they went through and all the sacrifices that they made to give me and all those who come after me a better life. Hopefully, all of their sacrifices will be remembered and treasured by all of you who have heard this story. So thank you so much. I'm going to come away from the sharing the screen, and hopefully I'm in good time for a Q&A now.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth, for just that wonderful presentation and for sharing your knowledge and you and your family's story with all of us this evening. Thank you. So I'm Laura Grant. I'm the program assistant here at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I'm going to transition us into the Q&A section for today's program. So please submit your questions for Ruth using the Q&A button that you should see at the bottom of your screen. And thank you to everyone who's already submitted their questions. For those of you joining us on Facebook, please submit your questions in the comment field and a member of our tech team will pass them along to be answered here. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can within the given time frame, focusing on questions that most closely relate to the topics presented this evening. And as we move into Q&A, I'd also like to let everyone know that we're going to share a link now in chat to our museum store, Esther's Place, where you can purchase a copy of Ruth's new book, Letters from Cuba, to explore her grandmother Esther's story more fully. And your purchase also helps support the work of the museum and allows us to continue to provide you with experiences like the one this evening. So thank you. We already have many questions coming in the Q&A. I'm going to start with the first one, which goes back to the beginning of your presentation about Cuba being a refuge for Jewish immigrants. Did Cuba have a quota on Jewish immigration, and what made them so tolerant to foreigners during that early period?
Yeah, I don't believe that they had a quota, but definitely in the late 30s there was some pushback, and there was even a Cuban Nazi party was formed because the Nazis did send some agents into Cuba to try to spread anti-Jewish propaganda in the late 30s. So there was definitely some pushback in that period, but overall, Cubans are very, very tolerant of people of all backgrounds, and Jewish people did not feel discriminated. And to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there was a quota. I think Jews were admitted for many different reasons. I think there was also something to do with anti-Black racism in this period, and the Jews were being admitted initially as Europeans, essentially. The early 20th century was a moment when many Europeans immigrated to Cuba. Many Spaniards, curiously, immigrated to Cuba, even though they had lost the Spanish-American War. Cuba was actually more developed than Spain at the time, and many Spaniards also had come to like Cuba and immigrated to Cuba in the early 20th century. And that's the same period in which the Jews immigrated from Europe. So I think initially it was the sense that they were Europeans, and Cuba wanted to whiten their population because many felt that Cuba had become too Black by the end of the 19th century, that the Black Cuban population had grown and had become stronger and more sure of themselves as a community. And the white elite was very concerned about the growth of the Black Cuban community and wanted to bring more European immigrants to Cuba. Curiously, Jews in Cuba were just simply called Polacos, Polish people. And sometimes, there was not that much understanding of what it meant for them to be Jewish. It's like they knew that people were coming from places like Poland, and so many were coming from Poland that the term for a Jew became Polako. So sometimes people didn't totally understand what it meant to be Jewish. They just thought, oh, this is a person from Poland, or this is a person from Turkey. And so I think that there just wasn't, the knowledge of what a Jewish person was. I think that that was part of the reason that there also wasn't discrimination, because that hadn't been sort of taught to people in Cuba. I also think the African presence had a lot to do with filtering away anti-Semitism. The traditions that came from the Yoruba were just so different and sort of had nothing to do with the Jewish-Christian conflict. So I think that also played into the fact that the Jewish people felt very, very tolerated in Cuba.
Thank you. That was really interesting. So continuing on about questions related to immigration, why was Castro willing to let people leave Cuba after the revolution? And then kind of combining it with the next one, which was then was the US in turn more willing to allow Jewish immigration after the Cuban Revolution became communist? So both that leaving and
Yeah.
coming to.
Well, part of it was that, Fidel Castro was kind of glad that people that didn't agree with him were leaving. It was kind of
Mhm.
easier if the dissidents just left and didn't create a problem. And that sort of became the propaganda as well. Those people who left were called the worms of the revolution, not just Jewish people, but anybody who was leaving Cuba. The early 60s was called a gusano, a worm of the revolution. So by insulting those who left, it was like, okay, you're leaving, well, then you're a worm. You don't want to be part of this great revolution. So it was a way of insulting those that were choosing to leave and treating them as basically subhuman for wanting to leave Cuba. So I think part of the reason was let them go. If they're not really going to be
Mhm.
supportive of this cause, it might be easier to have them leave. And then on the other hand, the United States wanted Cubans to come to the US in this period, because every Cuban who came to the US was a symbol of the fact that communism wasn't working, right? And we have to remember that the 1950s was the period of the Cold War. We were just coming out of the Cold War in the early 60s. And so every Cuban, represented, a failure of communism. They're coming here to the US because, the revolution has failed in Cuba. So they actually wanted us as immigrants, and Cuban immigrants in this period in the early 60s were treated very well by the United States and were given a fast track to citizenship, which no other Latino community has received. And so it was a very, very kind of different immigration pattern, I guess you would say. Though I have to add that Fidel Castro was concerned that so many Jewish people were leaving Cuba in the
Mhm.
early 60s. And it's my understanding that he gave a speech actually when he saw that, that 90% of the community was leaving. He gave a speech saying, "Why are all the Jews leaving? We have nothing against the Jews." So he was aware that the Jewish community had basically left in a mass exodus in that period of the early 60s, but also couldn't quite stop it.
Mhm. So then in turn, someone is asking about the Jewish community that remained in Cuba during this period, during the Cuban Revolution when they adopted communism. And specifically, can you describe some of the challenges faced by this community in terms of being able to practice their faith? Were they persecuted? What are some of the challenges for the Jewish community that remained in Cuba during this time?
Yeah, so it was a community of about 2,000 after the revolution who stayed, and it was a range of people. So it wasn't like there was just one type. There was a range of people. There were some Jews who were involved in the revolution, so some of them were glad to be part of the revolution. One of the founders of the Cuban Communist Party was a Jewish Polish immigrant who helped to found the party in 1925. Fabio Grobart was his name. And so, for example, he and others like him, he's the most, salient figure, but others who were involved in the revolution were just glad to be part of this revolution. They were secular Jews and not as interested in observing the faith, but rather in just maintaining a Jewish cultural identity. So there were definitely people like that just kind of became part of the revolutionary process. There were some who had married out of the Jewish tribe, had married Jews who had married non-Jews, and had essentially just integrated into the larger Cuban mainstream, and so again weren't that involved in their Judaism. But then there were some that continued to be involved in their Judaism, particularly elders some Jewish elders remained. And there's a very poignant story that's often told about the Cuban Minion. And so often they would continue to, to hold services on Shabbat and so on in the synagogues that remained open, because some synagogues had to close because there weren't enough people attending the synagogues, and the synagogue buildings had to be given over to the Cuban government. But those that remained and were able to hold services, they had the Cuban Minion, where sometimes it would be 3 or 4 people praying. And of course, this was the male model, so it was, expected that it would be 10 men. So there might be 3 or 4 men praying, and then they would bring out the Torahs. So if there was 4 men, then they would bring out 5 Torahs. That was 9. And then the 10th for the minion was God. And that became known as the Cuban Minion. So they would create a minion, even though there were very few left who were praying. They would have these Cuban minions to be able to hold their services, because religion was not so much persecuted in Cuba as suppressed during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In Cuba, when they were, trying to build this revolutionary society. Then all of that changes in the early 90s, and Cuba allows people to practice religion again, starting in 1991. And so at that point, the synagogues start to revitalize, the churches start to revitalize, and so do the Afro-Cuban religions at this time. So it's a moment of great change. And then the Pope visits Cuba in 1998, and that's another moment of opening to religion. So since the 90s, Cuba has been opening to religion, has basically, as I've often said, has allowed God back into the island.
No, thank you. So we've gotten a lot of questions about Jewish life in Cuba today, and many people have had the chance to visit Cuba and are asking about what is the Jewish community in Cuba like today? Do you have any recommendations for visiting? How easy is it for people to visit, and sort of what can they expect? And what is the Jewish community there today?
Yeah, well, I was there right before the pandemic last year, the first week of March, last week of February, first week of March. So I literally saw the community right on the eve of the pandemic, and it was continuing in its very vibrant, lively way, very small amount of people, but holding on to the traditions, the faith, the culture. It was really, really, really impressive. With the pandemic, obviously things have been very, very difficult. There have been food shortages in Cuba in general, so the community has also been affected by that. They've been doing services virtually as well. Those that have access to the internet via WhatsApp, they've been connecting with one another. They are waiting for the vaccine. Some are already being vaccinated by a Cuban vaccine, but the process is going slowly, and that's going to probably take into the fall. It is possible to travel to Cuba. When I went last year, I was able to go on a Delta commercial flight from Miami to Cuba. I believe those flights still exist, and that it is possible to go. I think probably it's safest to wait a little longer, to wait at least till the end of the year, because if we go to Cuba now, we're essentially competing for very limited food resources and other resources on the island. So I think the best thing is to wait and to offer help from a distance. I have the hope of organizing a trip to Cuba next year. Hopefully in March of next year, I want to organize a trip focused on the book Letters from Cuba, and be able to take people to some of the places mentioned in the book, including the town of Agramonte, and to have like a book club meeting where people in Cuba will read the book in Spanish, and people from here will read the book in English, and we'll all discuss it. So I have that dream, hopefully for next year, when I'm hoping things will be safe and opening up again for travel to Cuba, for more easy travel to Cuba.
No, that sounds amazing. Good luck. I really hope that you're able to do that. So I think I will go ahead and ask this last question. Someone is asking if you could expand on the history of the St. Louis, specifically that you mentioned, and why Cuba refused entry of those passengers.
Yeah, it's a long story, and I have a book right here that I highly recommend, Refugee, if you haven't read by Alan Gratz incorporates the story of the St. Louis, the 1939 St. Louis, into his book. Essentially, it had to do with a conflict between the then president of Cuba and the then minister of foreign relations in Cuba, who issued these visas, and then the president basically declared them null. So all of these poor people on the ship had purchased at great expense these visas that then were declared null, and it had to do with this growing conflict about immigration to Cuba, the rise of some Nazi sentiment in Cuba because of the German agents that had been sent. And Cuba was under a lot of pressure to receive these immigrants. But as I said, the United States wouldn't take them either, nor did Canada. So it was really, I would say it was like a multi-country effort to not grant them refuge. But Cuba tends to get blamed for what happened with the St. Louis. So it's very, very sad. There's a lot of documentation about it. There's also a novel called The German Girl about it. So there's many, many resources to be able to read further. And there's the classic movie, The Voyage of the Damned, which you may remember from way back with Faye Dunaway, which is also the story of the St. Louis. So it really, it's a story that just, broke everybody's heart, that here were 934 immigrants that nobody would take and that were sent back to Europe. But several of them were able to find sanctuary in Great Britain and in other places. So they didn't all perish, but about 250 of them did perish in concentration camps.
With that, I will get us wrapped up. I just want to say once again, Ruth, thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us and seeing all the comments come in the chat. Many well wishes. Your presentation and your story really resonated with us in the audience this evening. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And I don't know if I'll be able to see everything in the chat. Maybe you could pass it on to me.
I will pass
later.
along the praises and the lovely comments to you.
But
yes, thank you.
Thank you to everybody who has been here tonight, family and friends and old and new friends. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Lovely. And I also want to say thank you to Trillian, who did the intro and provided tech support tonight. And thank you to our captioner, Joe Gale, for captioning tonight's program. Before you head out, we're just going to share a couple links in the chat. So up first, we'll have a link again where you can purchase Ruth's new book, Letters from Cuba, from our museum shop. I really encourage you to purchase that book to help support the museum and help support Ruth as well. We'll also have a link to Ruth's website where you can learn more about her and her work, and a link to learn about the other book that she mentioned as part of her talk, An Island Called Home. And then finally, we'll have that link again from the beginning of the next program in our series on global Jewish life. From May 25th through 27th, we'll be hosting a virtual screening of On the Banks of the Tigris, which tells the hidden story of Iraqi Jewish music. So you can register for that offering via the link that will be shared in chat. And then finally, just as a reminder, as you exit the webinar this evening, you'll be directed to a survey about your experience. If you could take just a couple moments to fill that out, it really does help us as we plan for future programs. So with that, I will just say thank you again, Ruth, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you all have a great evening, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.